My name is Dave Nave. Russell Ackoff brought new insights into managing the interactions between the parts of a company rather than managing the behavior of each part individually. He called this approach systems thinking, and his insights are a tremendous contribution to business and society. On behalf of the Deming Cooperative, we are pleased to make these videos available to you for your continued learning.
He was a Dutch professor who worked at Tavistock. His name was Hans van Beenem. And I knew him well, so I jumped up to greet him. And in the course of exchanging amenities, it became apparent he was very depressed. And that was an unusual state of mind for him. So I asked him, I said, Hans, what's the matter? You know, you're down in the dumps. That's not characteristic. He said, oh, he said, Russ, he said, I've got a problem. It's terrible. I'm getting nowhere with it, and I don't know where to go. And it's got me down. So I said, well, why don't you tell me about it? He said, no. He said, no point in bothering you with my problem. I said, yes, there is. I'm not doing anything. I'm waiting for Fred, and it might help if you just talk about it. Well, he finally agreed. We went into his office. He took his coat off, and we sat down comfortably. And now this is the story that he told me. He said, there's a city in Europe in which the principal form of transportation is a double-decker bus. He said the double-decker bus is a large rectangle. There's a glass screen across the front, and separated is another glass-enclosed compartment where the driver sits. And the motor is under a hood to his left. There's another glass screen across here in the back, and seats are arranged with the center aisle. You enter or leave the bus back here, and there's a stairwell here that goes up to the upper level that covers this section of the bus, and there's a conductor back here. The conductor collects the fare from people coming on the bus, and the system uses what's called a zoned fare system. The city is divided up into areas, and your fare is a function of how many areas you go through to get to where you want to go. Now, if any of you have ever used a taxi cab in Washington, D.C., you've used the zoned fare system. If you recall, in Washington, the cabs do not have meters. You pay for the number of zones that you pass through. So you get on a bus. If it's zone 2, you want to go to zone 5, you say zone 5. He'll give you a receipt for 3 zones. When you get off, he's supposed to check your receipt to make sure you didn't cheat. And he has one other function we'll see in a moment. Now, the problem arose from the following set of conditions. This is all being described to me. Management decided to increase the productivity of the bus system by introducing incentives. For the driver, that was easy. They gave him a card which listed the time he was expected to arrive at each terminal at the ends of his tour and leave. Every time he came to a terminal, he had to punch in a time clock, and he left, he would punch out. At the end of the week, they would calculate the magnitude of his deviations from the expected times, and his compensation was a function of how close he kept the schedule. On the average, he made more time under the incentive, more money under the incentive system than he had with the fixed salary. And so the drivers liked the incentive system. Now, the conductor's incentive was much more complicated. They had plainclothes inspectors get on the bus, and in a normal 8 hours, 5 times, a plainclothes inspector would get on a bus, unknown to the conductor, and watch him to see if he collected the fare from everybody who got on the bus, and if he checked the receipt of everybody who got off the bus. And every time one was observed not to do these things, he got a demerit. And his compensation was a function of the number of demerits he got, and on the average, conductors made more money under the incentive system than they did under the old fixed salary system. Well, that was the system, and it led to an outbreak of violence. How? One day, at peak hours, downtown, about 30 people got on a bus at a given stop. Now, the conductor did not try to collect the fare from each person as they get on the bus. It would hold it up too long. So he lets them get on the bus, and he tries to collect the fare between stops. On the average, stops were 3 blocks apart, as they are in New York City for the buses on Fifth Avenue. Then, between stops, he would try to collect the fares. And in this case, he had to climb up the stairs, which was covered with people, because at peak hours, the bus gets overloaded. There are people standing in the aisles, standing in the stairwell, and he gets upstairs just about the time they're approaching the next stop. Does he go down to give the driver a signal? No, because they had a very sensible rule. The rule read as follows. The driver must stop at the next stop unless he gets a signal from the conductor which says, don't stop. So now the conductor says to himself, I better collect the fares from the people up here, and the hell with giving a signal, because he's going to have to stop anyhow. And then if anybody wants to get off or on, they can. If they don't, he will see that through the rear view mirror and go ahead. He'll lose a little time, but that's his problem, not mine. So the conductor doesn't go down. Now, one day, this happened at 3 consecutive stops. The bus stopped, nobody got on or off the bus while the conductor's upstairs still trying to collect the fares. The driver's furious because his money is going down the drain. He parked the bus at the curb, opened this door, came out, came around the bus, went up the stairs, got a hold of the conductor, pulled him off the bus, and beat hell out of him. This started a war. This is all the story being told to me. There are 2 separate unions, the union of the conductors and union of the drivers. But something more important, there was a racial difference. The drivers were all true blue natives. The conductors were almost all immigrants of a minority race, and tremendous racial prejudice in this culture, which got expressed in the animosity between the conductor and the driver. The result was that 2 unions formed bands of their employees, armed them with clubs, and they went around town at night looking for each other and engaged in physical combat. In the first week, over 12 people were seriously injured and hospitalized. The press got after management and said, you got to do something about this. This is crazy. And management said, look, these are grown people. They're adults. Let them alone. They'll see how stupid what they're doing is, and it will stop. Absolution. The second week, the number of injuries more than doubled. Press got after management and said, you cannot wait any longer. You must do something. Well, management and its intelligence sat down and said, what's the cause of this problem? It's that damn incentive system. We'll eliminate the incentives and go back to the flat salary. So that's what they announced. And both unions said they would go on strike. Why? They said, unless you are willing to pay us the highest compensation we got under the incentive system as a fixed salary, we are not willing to go back to work. Management said, we can't pay you that compensation unless you can guarantee us the same productivity we got when we paid that to you. The union said, we can't do that because that depends on the weather and on drivers, which we don't control. And the management said, we can't pay you that salary. So the problem remained unresolved. The next step was they called 2 professors from a local university in to look at the problem. And characteristically, they took one quick whiff and they said, it's simple. All you have to do at the end of the week is add the incentive payment to the driver and the conductor. Add them together and divide them in half. And now each one will depend on the other. Well, it seemed to make remarkable sense. So the management announced it, and both unions said they would go on strike. Why? They would not allow any portion of their compensation depend on the goodwill of the other, because they said there wasn't any. So they refused. Now, it was at this point that they came to Tavistock Institute and said, we've tried all this, nothing works, what can you do to make things better? Now, Tavistock was known for its work by bringing people together into a dialogue to discuss possible solutions to problems and to work it out. And that's what Tavistock did. Hans von Baden said, now here's what I did. I rented a room in the best hotel in the center of the city. And it was a room that had a banquet table in the middle. So we had a big banquet table in the middle. He said we had two sideboards, one set up with food, with the quality and quantity of food that these people normally had not experienced, drivers and conductors. It was fancier and more gourmetish than anything they normally ate. And I had drinks on the other side, with a greater variety of whiskeys and beers and wines than they normally had access to. He said each evening I picked 4 drivers and 4 conductors at random, and at 6:30 they came into this room. Between 6:30 and 7:30 they were free to mingle and eat and drink at will. At 7:30 we sat down at the table with 4 drivers on one side, 4 conductors on the other, and 2 people from Tavistock, one at each end of the table. He said, I have just come from the 3rd such session. They have all ended in physical violence. He said, we are now being sued by the hotel for physical damage. He said, I don't know what to do. He says, that's why I'm depressed. What do I do next? And then he paused as though he suddenly had an insight. He said, hey, you got any ideas? I said, no, of course not. I said, but I got some questions. He said, like what? I said, well, how many buses are in the system at peak hours? He said, Rush, you don't understand, it doesn't make any difference. If it's 10 or 1,000, it's still the same damn problem, because the problem is on a bus, an individual bus. And I said, yeah, but the bus is a part of a system. And I don't have a picture yet of the system of which it's a part. And so I can't really appreciate the problem until I see it embedded in the whole. He said, that's a bunch of theory. He said, it's a lot of trouble to get the number of buses. I said, will you tell me where to go? I'll go. He refused, and he came with me reluctantly. We went into the files and found out there were 1,250 buses operating in the system. It's a big system. He looked at me and said, all right, what do you want to know now? I said, well, I'd like to know how many stops there are. He said, Rush, you really don't understand the problem. He said, don't you see it doesn't make any difference how many stops there are? The only requirement is that there are stops to create the problem. The number is irrelevant. I said, but it's part of the system, and I don't understand the system yet. Well, what do you have to understand the system for to understand the problem? The problem's on the bus. I said, I cannot understand the way a part is functioning independently of the whole of which it's part. He said, you know what we got to do? You got to get a map and count them. I said, you get the map, I'll count them. Well, he reluctantly got a map. We put a sheet of acetate on top of it and counted. There were 850 stops in the system, which meant that at peak hours, with stops 3 blocks apart, on the average, there was more than 1 bus between stops. Now, if you go to New York, 5th Avenue at peak hours, you'll see exactly the same conditions. There's more than 1 bus between stops on the average. If you look at those 2 numbers, however, you can dissolve the problem. Can you see how to do it? I can make a change in the system which will eliminate the problem, not solve it.
Express buses.
No.
Increase the stops to 1250 or decrease the bus to...
No. None of that will do it. You take the conductor off the bus and put him on the stop. Now what happens? You reduce the number of conductors at peak hours from 1,250 to 850. He collects the fare from people who are waiting to get on the bus. He's always at the rear door to check their receipts when they get off the bus. He's always in a position to signal the driver of an oncoming bus. The moment the number of buses become less than the number of stops, the drivers get back on the bus. What this allowed them to do is to go from 4 on, 4 off, 4 on, which is the way they worked because of peak hours. All the drivers and conductors were now put on 8-hour shifts because the variation between peak hours and non-peak hours was significantly reduced. They could go on to level shifts. Now, if you stop and think about it, that's the way a subway system works. The subway doesn't have the conductor on the train. The conductor's at the stop. It's a change in the system. Now, the city for which this was done responded in a remarkable way. They put canopies up at each stop to protect people from the rain. They put piping up to form organized queues so that the conductor could more easily collect the fares. And other cities now around the area have emulated what this city did. Dissolve the problem. See, the beauty is the problem cannot arise in this system. There's no way the conductor and the driver can come into conflict because the conductor has absolutely no effect on the time consumed by the driver. Any questions about that? Okay.
What happened to the compensation system?
They went back to a flat salary, which was less than the peak, and they were happy to settle for it because most of them now took a second job that was part-time, which they were never able to do before because they had 12 hours out of the day. Yeah. Now, where are we? Okay.
What year was that?
Oh, this would have been, I guess, in the early 1980s. Yeah. Roughly would be somewhere back there. Yeah.
West Indians were they?
I'm sorry?
The West Indians were the conductors, were they?
Yeah. Yeah. You can tell by the way I drew the bus that it's England. This was a problem in a major city of England. Yeah. Not London, by the way. It was not London. The interesting thing that emerges out of this analysis is that what research was to analytic thinking, design is to synthetic thinking. Design becomes the mechanism by which problems are best treated by one who thinks systemically. You see, design is synthetic. It puts things together into wholes. Analytic takes things apart. It disaggregates. Design aggregates. So there's been a lot of attention given now to the methodology of design. And the most important development is due to something that happened at Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1951, which has had an incredible impact on our concept of how to conduct design of systems. By sheer luck, I happened to be there as a visitor when this occurred and became a part of it accidentally. And it was the most important accident in my life. The story goes that at that time I was on the faculty of Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. And all institutes of technology have constant visitors from large high-tech companies like Boeing who look for our best graduate students and try to sign them up before they reach the end of their academic career. AT&T had a representative who called on Case once a month. He was a young man by the name of Peter Myers, who was a PhD in physics from Oxford University in England because he had attended it as a Rhodes Scholar. He was brilliant. We became friends. We were the same age, roughly. It turned out he had just married, as I had just married when I met him. And pretty soon, he would arrange to come to Case for his work on a Friday or Monday, bring his wife along and spend the weekend with my wife and me. We had work in New York. I would arrange to go to New York on a Friday or Monday, take my wife, and spend the weekend with him. He lives in Morristown, New Jersey, about 30 minutes out of New York. We began to do some work together. And whenever we could, we would steal a day to work on whatever we were doing together. I had a project at the time with Union Carbide in New York, and I'd arranged to be there on a Thursday to work on the project. So I called Peter and said, I've got to be in New York on Thursday. Can I come down and spend Wednesday with you at Bell Labs? He said, yeah, by all means. So I made the plans appropriately. But on Tuesday, about noon, I got a call from Union Carbide saying there was a crisis on the project. Come in right away. So I grabbed some clothing, hopped a plane, got in New York late in the afternoon, and we worked well into the night, and I don't remember what the problem was, but we got it taken care of. At sometime around 10:30, 11 o'clock, they got somebody to get me a room in a nearby Sheraton hotel. I got up early the next morning, rented a car, drove to Murray Hill, which is not far away, and got into Pete's office before he did. About 8:45, about 10 to 9, he walked in, and for the first time in our association, he was angry. He didn't even say good morning. First thing he said when he came in is, where the hell were you last night? I said, I was in New York. Why? What's the problem? He said, I know you were in New York. Your office knew you were in New York, but nobody knew where you were. Why don't you let people know where you were? I said, for a good reason, Pete. I didn't know where I was till about 10:30 last night. But what's the problem? What are you excited about? And he calmed down. He said, I'm sorry. He said, I'm not angry at you. I'm just mad at the situation. I said, what's the situation? He said, at 4:30 yesterday afternoon, I got a call from the vice president in charge of the laboratory. He said that every section head would be required to attend the meeting today at 9 o'clock, and absolutely no excuse would be accepted. We had to clear our calendar and be there. He looked at the clock, he said, in about 4 or 5 minutes, I've got to be at that room. I tried to get a hold of you to tell you not to come. I can't spend any time with you. I said, well, it's a shame, but it couldn't be avoided given the circumstances. I got some work with me. I'll work in your office. If you're not back by noon, I'll go to New York. So you better get going. Well, he said, I know that's what you'd say. I feel badly about it. He turned around and started to walk out, and he stopped. He said, wait a minute. He said, why don't you come with me? I said, I can't go with you. You said it's a meeting of section heads. He said, hell, he said, I'll never know the difference. Come on. I said, yeah, but Pete, suppose somebody does know the difference. Won't you get in trouble? And he paused. He said, I'll tell you what. He said, you come with me, but we won't sit together. So if they catch you, I'll pretend not to know you. I said, what the hell? They can't do anything to me. So off we went. Now, what we got to was a small classroom that held somewhere between 35 and 40 people. And it was characteristic. It was a rectangular room. It had a one-step-up platform at the end with a big blackboard across the back and a podium in the middle. Then the seats arranged with the center aisle. And by sheer luck, when we arrived, the two seats that were empty that immediately struck us were the ones on the back row, separated by the aisle. I took this one, and Pete took that. Now, you see, we weren't together. We were separated by the aisle, but we could chat across the aisle like casual acquaintances. The vice president wasn't there, and that was unusual. It was 10 after before he appeared, and this was absolutely unusual. The vice president was 6'3", 250 pounds, a back-slapping extrovert. He couldn't get near you without hugging you, punching you, pinching you, pushing you. He had to have physical contact with everybody. He had his nose in everybody's business. He was incredibly aware of everything being done in the laboratory. He was a great manager. They all respected him tremendously, but they hated to spend a lot of time with him. I remember one fellow saying it was like eating something that was too sweet. You can take a shorter period of time with him, but after a while it just wears you down. Well, he wasn't there. That was unique. It was about 10 after or so when the back door squeaked, everybody turned around, and there he was. They knew immediately there was a crisis. He was a pasty gray. He was bent over, not as usual, erect self, and he started down the aisle slowly, walking without saying a word to anybody. This is absolutely uncharacteristic. He got up to the platform, got behind the podium, put his elbows down, and simply held his head. And everybody in the room was dead silent. What in the world is wrong? Is this some kind of a trick, or has he had a catastrophe in the family? So you could hear a pin drop. And after what seemed like an hour, but was only a short time, he looked up. And in a very uncharacteristic, weak voice, he said exactly this. Gentlemen, the telephone system of the United States was destroyed last night. He looked down. Now the room broke out in a hubbub. Why? For one thing, a lot of us had used the phone that morning, so it couldn't have been destroyed last night. Furthermore, it's not possible. You see, how can you destroy the system? You can destroy a link. But the fact is, the telephone system isn't a system, it's a network. And a network doesn't have any essential parts. And so you can take any part out of a network, and there's a way of getting around it. If I take away the wires connecting Los Angeles and San Francisco, I can still communicate between the cities by going through Las Vegas or Reno or someplace like that. So how can you destroy the telephone system of the United States? It's not possible. You can destroy a link, but not the system. What in the world is he up to? Well, the room quieted down. He looked up a second time. And in his weak voice, he said, I know what you were just saying. You were saying you used the phone this morning, and the system is still there. Am I right? Well, we were greatly relieved, because this shows he's in touch with reality. So everybody in the room went like this, yes. And then he straightened up. He began to tremble with rage. His face became red and flushed, and he looked like he was about to explode when he shouted, damn it! I told you the telephone system in the United States was destroyed last night. You better believe it. If you don't believe it by noon, I'm going to fire you. And he looked down again. Now the hubbub really did break out. What in the world is he up to? Well, after a while, they decided discretion is probably the better part of valor when your boss is involved. So they quieted down to get a little bit more information. He looked up the third time, and after a moment or two, he straightened up, and it was a remarkable transformation. It looked like everything got solved instantaneously. His color came back, and he broke out in a great big belly laugh. It was a trick. Everybody in the room started to laugh with him. Didn't know why, but the relief was so great that everybody laughed. In a short while, the laughter stopped, and now in his perfectly normal voice, he said, now what was that all about? He said, I'm going to tell you, but before I do, I want to make two things absolutely clear. He's now talking normally. One, the telephone system in the United States was destroyed last night. Two, you better believe it. If you don't believe it by noon, I'm going to fire you. Now why? He had everybody's attention. He said in the last issue of the Scientific American, you all know that journal? It's the principal popularizing journal of science. He said there was an article about industrially based research and development laboratories. And it said that Bell Labs are the best industrially based R&D laboratories in the world. He said, I believe that. Is there anybody in this room who doesn't? And of course, nobody raised their hand. He said, good. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper that had been folded and was covered with handwriting, which we couldn't read. He said, it occurred to me to make a list of the principal contributions we have made to the development of the telephone. And why do we have this reputation? He said, now before I share my thoughts, I'd like to get yours. What do you think are the major contributions that Bell Labs have ever made to the development of telephonic communication? Multiplexing is a way of sampling sound, so you can send 6 telephone conversations across the same wire at the same time. It increased the capacity of AT&T by 600%. It was a huge change. He said, when did we introduce it? Somebody knew. It was between the two world wars. When did we invent it? Nobody knew. He said, I looked that up, and it was before 1900. He said, let's take one more. The third one thrown out was the coaxial cable, which connected the USA and Britain. He said, right, you now have the same first three that I have. When did we build the cable? I remember that date, 1882. He said, now, gentlemen, you have the same first three I have. And every one of them was developed before anybody in this room was born. What the hell have you been doing? He said. And I'll tell you what you've been doing. And it's not your fault, it's mine. He said, you've been looking at the parts of the system taken separately and improving them, but you've had no effect on the system as a whole. There's something wrong in the research strategy of this laboratory, he said. Therefore, gentlemen, the telephone system of the United States was destroyed last night, and we're going to design the system with which we would replace it with today. Right now, if we were free to replace it with any system we wanted, subject to only two minor constraints. Now, he said, before I discuss the constraints, let me make clear why I'm doing this. He said, in most planning, what you do is pick a period 5 or 10 years out and say, where do you want to be then? He said, the one thing you know is that 5 or 10 years from now, you're not going to want to be where you say you're going to want to be, because things will happen between now and then to change your mind. So I want to know what we would do right now if we could do whatever we wanted. I don't have to forecast. He said, furthermore, if you don't know what you would do right now, if you could do whatever you wanted, how in the hell can you know what you want to do 5 years from now? He said, we're going to do it with virtually no constraints. Why? If you don't know what you would do, if you could do whatever you wanted, how can you know what to do when you can't do whatever you want? So he said, we're going to redesign the telephone system from scratch, and we're going to do it with only two constraints. First one, the system we design must be technologically feasible. I don't want any science fiction, he said. And then he used a wonderful set of examples. The first one, he said, is you cannot use mental telepathy to replace the telephone. Now, that may sound strange, but in 1951, there was a major discussion in scientific circles about the work going on at Duke University on parapsychology, or the use of telepathy for communication. It was a big debate. The vice president said, I don't want to argue about whether it exists or not, because we don't know how to use it if it does exist. Technological feasibility says that you must have the knowledge required to do it. He said, now you can't use telepathy, but you can use communication satellites, which we don't have. Why? Because we're designing them, and we know now that there's no knowledge required to put a satellite up there for communication purposes, no knowledge required that we don't have. So he said you can innovate and invent, but not assuming knowledge which you don't have. Now, we spent an hour discussing that until that was internalized in the group. We're at about, I would say, 10:30 in the morning. He said, now, second requirement. The system you design must be operationally viable. Now, he said, what's that mean? It means that if it came into existence, it would survive in the current environment. You see, we're not changing the environment, he said, we're only changing the system. So if we're going to create a new system, it's going to have to obey the law. If it's a private corporation, we'll have shareholders with obligations to them. It's going to have certain environmental regulations we have to pay attention to. And he went on listing a set of requirements, but he said, note, I did not say the system has to be capable of being implemented. He said the requirement is that if it were implemented, it would survive. The requirement is not that it be implementable. He said all bars are reduced. so that we don't have to worry about whether it can be implemented or not. Now, we're about 11:30 in the morning after having discussed it. He said, this group is too big to work as a single design group. So I'm going to have to divide you up. I'm going to put you into 6 groups, he said. Each group is going to get a subsystem. He said, that's a problem. But the way we're going to handle it is as follows. Each subgroup will pick a representative. They will meet each week. Every subgroup will be free to do whatever they want to do, providing it doesn't affect any other subgroup. But if it affects what another subgroup is doing, they must agree before they can do it. At the end of the year, he said, I want to see one seamless design of the entire system. I don't want to know what the 6 subsystems were. I want to see the whole. We discussed that. We're about 10 of 12. He said, I want to break for lunch, so I want to pick the teams quickly. He said, I'm going to use the latest developments in organization theory. And this is what he did. He started over here. He said, the first 6 of you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He said, you're the long line team. That meant design the connections between cities. The next 6 were the short line teams, which is within cities. The next 6 were the switching stations. And he worked through 5 teams and ended right here. And then he said, the rest of you will redesign the telephone set. And there I was on a team, and on the same team as my friend Pete Myers. So the teams immediately got together in the back of the room when it was adjourned, and Pete introduced me to the other members of the team, and they thought it was very funny that an outsider had snuck into this thing. And they said, he didn't tell us we can't have outsiders participate, so if you want to participate, please. That turned out to be an unfortunate invitation because I spent most of the next year at Bell Labs working on this thing rather than at Case, which was paying my salary. But boy, what a year it was, and I want to give you a sense of it. We met for the first time that afternoon in a small breakout room. There were 7 of us, 6 from Bell Labs and me. The room had a little table with chairs around it, an easel and a pad, and a little table on the side with a telephone. We gathered around the table and said, where do we begin? Somebody said, why don't we make a list of all the things that are wrong with the telephone and then see if we can't design a phone that eliminates those deficiencies? Somebody else says, that's not a good way of going about it. Why not? Because when you get rid of what you don't want, you do not necessarily get what you do want. Now that turns out to be a very fundamental principle of systems thinking. You see, suppose you turn on a television set. Just go out, find a television set, turn it on. What's the probability that a program you want will come up? Well, you probably haven't calculated it. I have. 0.01. 1 out of 100 times I'll get a program I want. That's a deficiency. It's easy to get rid of. What do? Turn a channel. What's the probability I'll get a program I want? 0.01, which means I got virtually a 50-50 chance of getting something I want even less. See? When we try to get rid of alcoholism, we got organized crime. The first critical principle of management ought to be effective management must be directed at what you want, not against what you don't want. And so after this discussion, we said we forget the system doesn't exist. You can't talk about what's wrong with what's not there. What properties do we want a phone to have? That's the critical question. Well, then it started to pour out. We put them on an easel, a pad. The first one was, every call that I receive is intended for me. In normal language, that's no wrong numbers. The second suggestion was one that I made. I said, I want to know who's calling before I answer the phone so I don't have to answer it if I don't want to talk to them. Everybody agreed. The next one was obvious. I want a phone I can use without hands. The fourth one was wonderful, I thought, the best one. I don't want to go to the phone. I want a phone that comes to me. Well, we were getting warmed up. We went on for 3 weeks, and we wound up with 92 properties that we wanted a telephone to have. They got very complicated. This 92nd was, I would like to be giving a lecture to groups in multiple locations, say 8 different cities. And I would like to be able to see the audience in each of the 8 cities. I want them to see me and hear me. And if somebody in the group has a question to ask, I want a full face picture of them so I can see the face clearly. If I draw a chart, I want it to appear immediately where I'm lecturing. And so on, a very complex audio-visual communication system with multiple destinations. But we ran dry. There we were. No more we could think of. So what do we do now? Well, what we decided is let's take the first item and just see, well, can we design a telephone where every call that I receive is intended for me? Now, at this point, I made a terrible mistake, and I virtually destroyed my acceptance in the group. You see, I was teaching a course in elementary logic at Case at the time, and I pointed out there are 2 kinds of wrong numbers. One is when you have the right number in your head and you dial it incorrectly. The other is when you have the wrong number in your head and you dial it correctly. But one of the groups said, suppose you have the wrong number in your head, dial it incorrectly and get the right number. Well, fortunately, they didn't think that was very likely. So the critical question that was left by all that was, what percentage of the wrong numbers are the right number are incorrectly dialed, or the wrong number correctly dialed? Well, we didn't know. Fortunately, I did know something that was relevant. I knew the head of the psychology department at Bell Labs, Dr. Samuel Carlin. I got him on the phone, and after the amenities, I said to him, Sam, have you ever done any work on wrong numbers? And he exploded. It was at least 4 or 5 minutes before I could calm him down enough. It turned out he'd been doing research on wrong numbers for 17 years, and I was the first one to ask him about it. So he wanted to just fill me with all of his knowledge. And all I wanted to know is the percentage of each type of wrong number. I finally got it. 80% of the wrong numbers are the right number incorrectly dialed. So he said, okay, let's go to work on that. We did. An absolutely unbelievable thing happened. In 30 minutes, we figured out how to eliminate that kind of error. Here's what we did. If you take a typical desk set of a telephone and look at it from the top down, it looks something like this. You have the dial here. We took the dial off the telephone and put something on it that didn't exist in 1951. Today it's commonplace. We put a handheld calculator on the telephone. So it had a register here, 10 keys set up with 3 rows of 3 and then 1 of 1. And then we had a red key down in the bottom. I don't know what I did with the red, but down here there was a red key like this. Now the way you use this phone is you come to it and put the number in without lifting the receiver from the hook. And the number you put in by punching the button shows here, 7918625. Remember, you got the right number in your head. You look at this number. Is it right? If it's right, you pick the receiver up and the whole number will go through. If it's wrong, you hit this button, it clears the phone, and you do it over. And that would virtually eliminate the incorrect dialing of the right number in your head. But there was a problem. We didn't know if that's technologically feasible. So we called a department at Bell Labs called Miniaturization. They sent 2 young men down in response to our request who were experts in miniaturization of electronics. And we started to explain what we were interested in. And as we're doing it, the 2 of them begin to whisper to each other, and pretty soon they're more engaged in a whispered conversation than they are in listening to us. And we were getting madder and madder. And finally, they did something that made us furious. They got up and walked out. No explanation, just got up and left. But we said, the hell with them. We're not going to go chasing them. We'll do something else. We did. It wasn't until about 3 weeks later they reappeared during one of our meetings, looking sheepish and apologetic. So you probably wondered what happened to us the last time we were here. We told them that was the understatement of the month. They said, we got very excited by what you were showing us, but not for the reasons you were. They said, that wrong number stuff isn't very interesting, but the push buttons are. We went back and we built a telephone with push buttons, and we tested it on 2,000 people. They said, it takes 12 seconds less to put 7 digits in a phone by pushing buttons than by turning a dial. And that's equivalent to a 20% increase in the capacity of AT&T. So we have started a project to develop that telephone. They said, we've given it a code name, which is still classified. So they looked around to make sure nobody was listening, and they gave us the code name, Touchtone. That's where the Touchtone telephone came from. Every single change which has occurred to the telephone since 1953 came out of that study. The impact of that redesign on the future of AT&T is just incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Now that process has since been used in hundreds of companies. It's called idealized redesign, and your charts have an essential summary of the characteristics of it.
Russ?
Yep.
Out of the 92 items, what number of those do you think are implemented in today's world?
We built prototypes of all of them. I'd say about 75 have been implemented. There are some which are just too expensive. I mentioned one yesterday. In one test, I stood in the Pocono Mountains with my hands in the air talking to Paris, France. There was a little gadget hanging around my neck on a cord. It was smaller than this, about half the size. And if you called me while I was talking to Paris, by pushing a button on here, in my voice, I could deliver 1 of 5 messages to you. One would say, hold on, I'm talking, I'll be with you in a minute. The other one would say, hang up, I'll call you as soon as I'm finished, I got your number, and so on, through 5 different messages that I had a choice of. And all of this, a little device that hung from my neck. Now, it can be built for you today, and there's an outfit in Chicago that will do so. It costs $360. Most people are not willing. Yet it'll be a while, but the technology will only make it available. We built the first mobile phone.
That was all in 1950 something?
1951. Let me show you something. What in the world did I do with it? Has any of you up here got a mobile phone handy? Okay, that's great. Just borrow it for a minute. That has all the characteristics I had up there, right? I put the number in before I lift the receiver. I read the number on the register. If it's right, I hit an activate button, which is the same as lifting the receiver, and the whole number goes through at once. This comes to me, I don't go to it. This is the phone that resulted from that. See. Now, in 1951, we did not have satellites, so we had to use a different technology. This was a small broadcasting unit. It was an oscillating unit. It literally broadcast like a radio station did, and therefore it had a limited range. I couldn't call across the country with the first mobile phones. They were only local phones. When the technology became available through satellites, we could go and develop the rest of the stuff. So, as technology has emerged, characteristics that we couldn't even imagine in 51, like email on a telephone, or transmitting photographs, or taking, all that stuff, has since become available. Any other questions? This is just a summary of the conditions that The idealized design is not utopian because it's subject to improvement, either by its designers or others inside as a result of experience. Now, it has some impacts which are not apparent that I want to go over with you. The first is a surprise. It was to me, but incredibly important. There are three conventional types of management, which we can represent graphically as follows. Here is time. Here is now. This is the future, and this is the past. And positions on this line represent where we are. So this is where we are right now. That's a point that moves from left to right continuously, okay? This is time also, but it's where we want to be. Now, one type of management called reactive wants to be where it once was because it believes that in the past conditions were better than they are now. It wants to react to the current state. So what it does is as follows. The planner or the manager stands in the present, looks back, and says, this is where I prefer to be. He lifts that to where he wants to be, and then his plan becomes a path from where he is to where he once was. And this is called reactive or reactionary planning. We've had such managers throughout history. Some of you may remember when the Industrial Revolution began in England, there was an immediate reaction called the Luddite movement. The Luddites broke in the factories and tried to destroy them at night so they could go back to guild manual production, which they said was a superior quality of life. They tried to destroy industrialization and urbanization. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, during the French Revolution, led a back-to-nature movement. He wanted men to go back to the country, desert the city, strip their clothes off, and prance over the prairies in the nude, reciting poetry and whistling Bach kind of thing, idyllic. In the late 19th century, William Morris and John Ruskin led a movement in England called the Gothic Revival. They actually built medieval villages and went back to craft production in an effort to capture what they said was the superior quality of life of the medieval period. That was all nonsense, but that's what they tried. In the 1960s in the United States, hippies organized in the bands and went up to Canada, in the western part of Canada, bought land, created communes, and tried to live off the land without the use of technology. These were idealized communities. There's a remarkable record of one of them written by the son of Kurt Vonnegut, who was one of the cult heroes of the 60s. His name is Mark Vonnegut. The book is called Return from Eden, which is a record of the effort of this group to live going backwards in time without any of the modern technology. So it's an old mode of management. The other one, which dominates today, is exactly the opposite. The planner stands in the present, but he's looking in the other direction. He's looking out this way. And he says, this is what the future is going to be like. That's what the forecast future is. Given that forecast, this is my vision of where I want to be. That's called a vision. And then the plan is the steps he's going to take to get from where he is to where he wants to be 5 or 10 years out. And that's called pro or pre-active. The third possible position is the manager who stands here and says, this is where I want to be. I don't want to change. And so he's effectively standing here on his head because this line and this line converge. He wants to be where he is. And so his objective is not to plan, but to prevent anything from occurring. Let well enough alone, don't rock the boat, let nature take its course. It's absolution. Those are the three dominant forms of management. Now along comes systems thinking. The first thing we say is what you got to do is decide where you would want to be right now, ideally. That's different. And then what you do is even more different. Instead of saying, how do I get there from here? You say, how do I get here from there? You plan backwards. Now, why in the world would you do that? I'll tell you why. You're not going to believe it until I give you illustrations. It has three impacts. First, it simplifies planning by an order of magnitude. Secondly, it will change your idea of what's feasible. And thirdly, it unleashes an unbelievable amount of creativity. Well, let's take the simplicity one first. How many of you have ever seen a child try to solve a maze? Okay. What does the child eventually do?
Go to the end and work back.
The child will eventually go from the exit to the entrance. It's much easier than going from the entrance to the exit. He doesn't know why, but he knows that that's so. He learns that quickly. How many of you know anything at all about tennis? Have played or watched? Oh, most of you. Good. Wimbledon, 64 players enter. How many matches will they have to play? Well, how many in the first round? If there's 64 players, 32 in the first round. How many in the next round? 16. How many in the next round? You can add them up. If some of you remember arithmetic or have a desk calculator, it turns out to be 83. But suppose instead of starting at the start of the Wimbledon, I start at the end. How many losers did there have to be if there were 64 players?
63.
No arithmetic. Isn't that nice? Now you can see how nice it is. Suppose 57 players entered Wimbledon. Then how many in the first round? Now you got a problem because it isn't divisible by 2. You've got to work out some special arrangement, but not if you do it my way. How many matches will have to be played if there are 57 entries? How many losers will there have to be? 56. I don't care how they do it. However they do it, there will have to be 56 matches. It's much simpler to work it from the back end forward. Secondly, what you discover when you do that is the principal obstructions between where you are and where you want to be, the hurdles between here and there, are not in they, them, it, the law, the boss, or something out there. The principal obstructions between man and women and where they want to be is in their heads. And you discover this when you plan backwards from where you want to be. See, the great American philosopher Pogo knew this. You remember he went hunting for the enemy once, and when he came out of the woods saying he had found them, his friend asked him, "Who is they?" And what was Pogo's famous answer? He is us. We are the enemy. Because it's the assumptions that we incorrectly make that obstruct our moving towards what we want. And the easiest way to see this is in a puzzle. A puzzle is a problem you can't solve because of something you incorrectly assume. And so much of what management does is convert problems into puzzles by making the wrong assumptions. Here's just take a simple one that you all did at one time or another. 9 dots, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I got two dots that are uncovered. That's progress. I have seen professors in the university work on this for hours and not solve it. Literally. Now, I hate to tell you this, but there is a book out, a pocketbook, the title of which is 1010 Solutions to the 9-Dot Problem. Believe it or not. The most common one is this. Well, let me just draw it. Let me take a fresh sheet. The one that most people know was this one, and it reveals what the incorrect assumption was. You ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. You see, I didn't tell you you can't go outside the square, but everybody assumes it. And you can't solve this problem inside the square. But that's self-imposed constraint. It's not in the problem. Now, that's only the beginning. Just look at some of the other constraints you want to make. When my daughter asked me when she was in school to solve this thing, I couldn't remember this solution, so I got a different one for her. It went like this. Nobody told me I couldn't fold the paper, so I folded the paper like this, and then did this. I do 1 line, 2, 3, 4. And when she was very happy with this, I said, now wait a minute, we can do it with 1 line. She said, no, I just want to know how to do it with 4. So I insisted she wait while I show her how to do it with 1. You fold the paper here and bring it down over the middle dots, fold the paper at the bottom, bring them up. It's a little awkward here. You get them just perfectly spaced and take a felt tip pen and you wind up with 3 lines like that. You can do it with 1 line. My daughter, youngest daughter, came in while we were doing this. She said, why don't you get a great big fat pen and just go blop? Why not? I didn't tell you what size pen to use. The book is full of 1-dot solutions. You all know origami. By the folding of this paper properly, you can bring all the dots into a single point and then go blop and do it. You see, it's self-imposed constraints that prevent you from seeing the solution. But when you work back from where you want to be to where you are, you see yourself as the obstruction and remove it, and that makes you a hell of a lot more creative. Yeah.
Is a self-imposed constraint the same as a belief?
Well, you may believe something incorrectly, but not all beliefs are self-imposed constraints. I believe you're there because I see you. That's not a constraint. Okay. Okay, any other questions? It's time for lunch. After that, I feel like a pornographic movie being shown to people who just engage in sex. So we have to get back to reality. There are 4 fundamental types of system, and the difference between the types has a great significance to management. So we make a little table here in which we show the type, and the type of system depends on whether the parts or the whole system can display choice. So, to take the simplest case first, there are systems in which the part cannot display choice, no choice, nor can the whole. These are mechanical systems where neither the parts of the whole have choice. A clock is an example, an automobile's example. These are called deterministic systems. Their behavior is entirely determined by external forces, given their structure. So all machines and mechanisms fall into this class, including automobiles, clocks, and so on. A second type of system is one in which the parts have no choice, but the whole does. And that's you. That's an animate system, a particular type of organism. So people and animals can make choices, but their parts can't. Your heart can't decide to take a vacation today, nor your lungs or your brain. You can. The third type of system is one in which choice is possible both in the parts and the whole, and Boeing is an example of such a system. It's called the social system. Choice at each of the levels. The third possibility is a system in which the parts have choice, but the whole doesn't. And this is an ecological system, or nature. See, nature behaves as a whole deterministically, but you and I are a part of nature and we have choice. These are the four fundamental types of system. Now, what's the significance and why bother to go through this? Well, that's what I want to show you. Now, I want to come back to here. Here we are. Let's look first at a corporate enterprise. The Industrial Revolution began in the United States in the middle 1800s. Sometimes it's dated back as far as 1830. And the reason it's so late in the history of the Western world is while Europe was industrializing, we were still pushing back the Indians and settling the land. In the 18th century, we were a nation of small villages that were disconnected, not connected by any transportation system or communication system. In fact, people are always surprised to find out the population of the United States at the time of the Declaration of Independence was 2.25 million. That's all it was. The largest city in the United States when the Declaration of Independence was written was New York, 32,000 people. Philadelphia was number 2 with 20,000. There were only 10 cities in the United States with over 12,000 people. And they weren't connected. As a consequence, there was no market. And industry didn't develop, and people were occupied with settling the land. And it wasn't until two things occurred, the railroads, which began to connect the small markets, making a bigger market to encourage industry, and communication through the telegraph. Both of these became available in the middle 19th century. Can somebody turn this feedback off? I don't know where it's coming from. Okay. We began to industrialize in the middle of the 1900s. And we caught up with Europe, which had been industrializing for over 100 years, by the time of World War I. Now, that period of time between roughly 1850 and World War I, when we began to create businesses, the United States did take the leadership in one respect. The first business school was created in the United States. 1881, the Wharton School was created by Joseph Wharton, who was a blacksmith who had been very successful. And he endowed a school to train young men on how to create and run a small business. That was what the Wharton School was about. Other major universities immediately followed suit. And as they did, the field of business and management was created. And it became necessary to say what a business is or what an enterprise is. It's not surprising that we looked at a business very much like the way we looked at the world. And Newton had decided how we looked at the world. The world was a mechanism created by God to do God's work. Then what was an enterprise? It was a mechanism created by God to do God's work. Exactly the same. Now, God was the owner. And the interesting thing was, in the 19th century, 1800s, the owner had as much control over the company he created as God did over the universe. There were no regulations or rules, no unions, no government laws. He could hire who he wanted to, when he wanted to, work them how he wanted to. As you know, it was a 60-hour week, 6 days, no vacations, sweatshops, women and children. He could employ under whatever conditions he wanted within the firm he created. He was God. Now, that condition was made possible by several external conditions which supported that role. The first was that the requirements of labor were minimal. No high technology was involved in production. And so uneducated labor was sufficient, and there was a big supply of it among the immigrants. They were very poorly educated. But the principal reason this idea of an enterprise could survive was the lack of Social Security. You see, there was no form of support for people who were not working except somebody who was working. And therefore, unemployment was a threat of destitution. In the United States today, we can't imagine what that was like. When 1957, I spent some time in India. And I was amazed to discover that in Calcutta, every morning, trucks went around and picked up people who had died on the streets overnight. And the number was between 2,000 and 5,000 every morning. This is destitution, people who had no form of support, nobody to support them. Imagine living with that threat over your head. You would be willing to work under any conditions. And they were. And so this concept of a corporation as a mechanism serving God prevailed. Well, what was the function of the mechanism? What purpose of God was it trying to serve? Produce a return on the investment. And so it came about, the profit became the objective of an enterprise conceived as a mechanism. And profit was a way of paying off God for his efforts in creating the institution. The high priest of this position, and the one who articulates it most frequently and conspicuously, is a Nobel Prize winning economist, Friedman. Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times a little while ago in the Sunday section in which he said, the only legitimate business of business is business. He said the function of a business is to produce a return to its owners and no other. As long as it obeys the law, it's performing its social function. That's the deterministic view of business. Now, what happened? Several things. First of all, as government observed what was happening with the development of industry, it became greedy and saw an additional source of income by taxing the profits of enterprises, which it began to do. As a result, it generated more income than it ever had before, more than it was using, a surplus. And now it had a choice. Do we return it to the taxpayer, or do we find a use for it? Well, I don't have to tell you what government did. Found a use for it. We're damn lucky it did, because that's what gave rise to public education at the end of the 1900s. So that by 1900, the educational level had started to go up, and by World War I, the educational level of the American worker had reached 8 years from 3 at the beginning. So we began to get a more educated workforce. Through increased mechanization of work, we required more training and investment in the worker, and he had to be more than barely literate. Unions had come into existence to protect their health and safety, and government regulation had begun. But the main thing which occurred is something which is widely overlooked. It's what happened at the end of World War II. The owner, God, was confronted with the following choice. This economy was so strong that the opportunities for growth exceeded the growth that could be obtained by reinvesting all the profit in growth. Let me repeat that. If a company took all of its profit and spent it entirely on growth, it could still not grow as fast as possible. Therefore, the fundamental choice confronting the owner was, do I retain control and constrain growth, or do I share control in order to generate additional capital so I can remove the constraints on growth? Now, in plain ordinary English, as do I stay private or do I go public? At the end of World War II, all of the corporations that subsequently survived went public. Now, what happened? God disappeared. AT&T suddenly had 225,000 owners. It's a little difficult to deal with that kind of a God. How do you get communication between the plain ordinary peasant, the worker, and God? Well, Peter Drucker was the high priest of that period, and he pointed out how. He said, this is no different than what happened 1900 years ago. God disappeared. We created an institution to serve as a communication link between man and God, and a profession to administer it, the church and the clergy. He says exactly what we did in business. The church is called management, and the clergy is called a manager. And how does the manager know the will of God, the stockholders? Exactly the way the clergy knows the will of God, by revelation. Right? And so the image of the corporation began to change, but it changed primarily because the rules and regulations imposed by unions and the government insisted on the preservation of the health and safety of the workforce. Now, health and safety was something a machine doesn't worry about. Automobiles don't worry about the health and safety of the carburetor or the fuel pump. Health and safety is a biological concept. And we began to think of the corporation as an animate system, as an organism. And this is reflected in all kinds of ways. The CEO, the chief manager, was called the what of the firm? The head. It's a biological concept. You see, he was never called a head when we thought of the corporation as a machine, but he now became the head. Stafford Beer, one of the principal thinkers that revealed the nature of this transformation, wrote two seminal books. The first was called The Brain of the Firm. The second was called The Heart of the Enterprise. You see, the biological analogy went over completely. He never wrote the third book. He unfortunately died a few months ago. I did write the third book in the trilogy, but I can't get it published. It's called The Bowels of the Company. The biological analogy went over completely, and the law officially made it official. According to the law, a corporation is a person. You see, when Arthur Anderson got in trouble, it was convicted of a crime exactly the way an individual would be, because the law says a corporation is a person. The real giveaway is the word corporation. You see, when you went public, a company became a corporation. What's the origin of the word corporation? Corpus. What's a corpus? A body. Even today, the prevailing view of an enterprise is that of an organism. Now what happened? World War II happened. In World War II, a very large portion of the workforce was drafted into the military, and very quickly. Only a few days after Pearl Harbor, I received a communication, a personal communication from the President of the United States. It said, greetings. And it told me to report in a couple days to the draft board, and in less than a week, I was whisked into the military. But about 90% of the workforce I was lucky, I was in graduate school at the time. So at a time when we demanded more productivity out of the American industrial system we ever had before, the bulk of the workforce was withdrawn from it. How did we solve that problem? Huh? You got it. Rosie the Riveter, Tilly the Toiler. It's marvelous to look at the films, the motion pictures made 42 to 46, because they're almost all about the heroin gal with the welding machine putting airplanes together while her boyfriend was flying them against the enemy. We had a predominantly feminine workforce with older people and younger people drawn in. And it was the first time in the history of the Western world that we had a workforce whose primary reason for working was not economic. It's a very important fact. Why? You see, when I was inducted in the military, like everybody else, my salary was $21 a month. Now, you couldn't even support yourself as a civilian on $21 a month. You certainly couldn't support dependents. But every dependent on a person drafted received an allowance from the government, which enabled them to live reasonably, not luxuriously, but reasonably. So Rosie the Riveter and Tilly the Toilet didn't have to work to survive. They could have survived on a government allowance. Why did they work? Commitment to the war effort. And therefore, if management wanted to get productivity out of those women, it had to be responsive to their reasons for working. It had to treat them as people, not as replaceable machine parts or as organs whose purposes were irrelevant. They had to take the reason that women were working into account in their management of them in order to get the productivity that they wanted. And so we have the emergence of a new kind of a workforce, and management for the first time having to look at the workforce as having purposes of its own that had to be taken into account. Now, this was reflected in a number of things that happened immediately after World War II. First, the GIs returned. And I can tell you, after 4 years of military discipline, everybody came out, swore to themselves on the Bible or anything else, they would never again submit themselves to the kind of mechanistic, irrational discipline they had suffered in the military. They weren't going to do it. It was a different workforce that came back to work. And that was reflected in the nature of the family. What we had at the end of World War II was something called the Spock Generation. Who was Spock? Spock was a child psychologist who wrote the Bible on how to raise children. What was the essential idea? Permissiveness. Raise a child so that the child learns by freedom of choice and from its own mistakes, not by discipline, by loving freedom was the basic idea. And so we had a new generation of workforce coming in that demanded freedom of choice, of consideration of its purposes, and this got reflected on a very huge scale in what happened socially. What happened socially was a series of movements which had the following characteristic. Here's a system. It has a lot of parts. And these parts have purposes of their own. Some of these parts began to organize, to protest the way the system of which they were a part was serving their interests, and saying, you have to stop thinking that we have an obligation to you without you having an obligation to us. Unless you serve our purposes well, we will not serve your purposes well. Do you recognize that? That was Martin Luther King and the race movement. That was the women's liberation movement. That was the generation gap. That was the alienation from work. It was the third world problem. Throughout the world, we had parts of the system organizing to protest the way the system of which they were part was serving their interests and demanding better service of their interests from the system of which they were part. That was a fundamental change. And simultaneously, another change occurred. Out of this system, there are other systems out here. And they began to demand that this system serve their purposes more effectively, claiming that they were destroying critical parts of their environment. There were two major social movements of this form. The first was the Ecological Movement, claiming that these things were destroying the environment which they had to live in. And the second was the consumerist movement. It said that corporations have an obligation to serve the purposes of their stakeholders, their customers, as well as their own. And so now suddenly we have, after World War II, primarily in the 50s, a concept of the corporation emerging in which management has to serve the purposes of the parts the purposes of larger systems in the environment of which it is a part, and its own purposes. And there are incompatible purposes at each of the three levels and between the levels. What's that? Chaos. And hence the theory of chaos and complexity, which emerges in the 70s and 80s. It comes out of the awareness of the multiplicity of purposes that management has to serve. And the corporation comes to be looked at as a social system. Now let's look at some of the implications of that. When it's a mechanism, it has no purpose of its own. It has a function. And its function is to serve its god or owner by making a profit. What happened when it became an organism? Profit became a means, not the end. What's the principal objective of every organism? Survival, right. Therefore, the principal function of a corporation was to survive. And then, interestingly, you have to grow in order to survive. Growth. Why? What's the opposite of growth? Contraction. What's the limit of contraction? Death. You see, if you start to contract, you're approaching death. You have to grow to approach life. Now, what happened to profit? Well, Peter Drucker came through again. He said, profit is to a corporation what oxygen is to a person, necessary for its existence, but not the reason for it. See, profit became a requirement, a means, not the objective. The great American humorist Ambrose Bierce put it even more effectively than Drucker. I don't know how many of you are familiar. I think one of the greatest books ever written was Ambrose Bierce's little book called The Devil's Dictionary. He was a columnist, and in his column each day he would take some word in the English language and tell you what it really meant. And the book is a compilation of his definitions. And his definition of money was marvelous. Money is the only resource which has no value until you get rid of it. Isn't that true? See, money is a means, it's not an end. So the question became, what's profit for? And the answer was survival and growth. Yeah.
Question, it seems that some companies have exceeded a healthy growth. So do you feel that there is a limit to?
Well, all growth may be healthy.
All growth may be healthy?
Sure, a basketball player can be healthy, but he's also an aberration. All right? Suppose he kept growing. Continuous growth in biology is an aberration. In the social system, as yet, we don't consider growth an aberration. But I'm going to come to a consideration of that in a moment. There is a set of conditions under which growth is justified and important, but not if those conditions are not satisfied. I'll come to that. But so it's a good question. Remind me if I forget. Now we come to the social system. What happens to survival and growth? Well, the same thing that happened to profit. This becomes a means to an end. What is the appropriate objective of a corporation treated as a social system? Well, there are two questions concerned. The first is, you see, when we came to the second stage, the corporation became an organism. When you come to the third stage, the corporation becomes a what? Charles Handy was the spokesman of this transformation. It becomes a community. The metaphor is the corporation as a community. Now, this has several incredibly important consequences, which we're only beginning to feel. The first one is San Diego or Los Angeles, whichever community you know. Let's take Los Angeles. It's a community. Who owns it? Who owns Los Angeles?
Government.